All right, Geoff.
All right. So, welcome everybody. This is great. I have to kind of joke whenever I do things like this. I'm always pleasantly surprised that people show up. So this is this is really great. It's a good turnout, and it's good connection. And we're going to talk a little bit. You'll see even the word connection in this presentation a little while. That's a big part of the coping. And so we're doing it right now. That should be pointed out up front, right? This is kind of the best we have for many scenarios, for many of us in isolation. And this is the key to getting through this stressful period. So what I've done, oh, and Marita, that was a really generous introduction. Thank you. that was very kind. Um, so what I've done for tonight is I've put together a PowerPoint, which I'm usually not a fan of. That's my disclaimer. But I think it's a way to share some information in this on this platform, and that will be more helpful than me just talking the whole time, and to give you more to kind of sink your teeth into, to hang on to. I'm going to move through some slides. I'm going to move through some material. I don't want to present too much material and too much data because it gets really dry, and I don't want it. I want us to stay more on the feeling side. We're going to do a few practices throughout this evening, to mostly breathing. We're going to do a few different breathing exercises that I'm a big fan of. So we'll start by talking about what stress is, what it looks like, and then we're going to move into ways to kind of cope better. So I'm going to go ahead with that being said, and I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start with PowerPoint. Um, so let me get this going. Here we are. All right, we're going to look at stress, and we're going to talk about how to better manage it. So again, thank you all for coming. Now, if you have any questions along the way, and we'll get into this more in a minute too, certainly always feel free to just unmute, jump right in and ask. That will be very welcome. All right. Now, here's where it all starts. For me, in my professional setting, as Marita alluded to, it's a very stressful place, very stressful work. And so I'm constantly looking at the easiest way to manage stress in the moment. And we're going to look at two different types of stress, essentially acute stress and more chronic stress. Right now, I'm talking about more acute stress and managing that. And the foundation of that management is always breathing, right? So if you think about breath, it is one of the few things that we have to do. And we cannot go very long at all without doing it, without breathing. Therefore, it becomes the most accessible tool we have to take care of ourselves. And so what I want to start off with is a breathing exercise, a brief breathing exercise called box breathing, and you may have done this. What I'm going to do is lead you through several rounds of box breath, and it's very simple. It's box breath because think of a box with four sides. On one side, you inhale for 3 seconds, you hold for 3 seconds, you exhale for 3 seconds, you hold for 3 seconds, and then it's repeated. Now, for some people, that might be a little long, depending on lung capacity, and that's fine. So you want to find the rhythm that is right for you. 3 seconds is just kind of a good general place to start. So I'm going to take some time now and lead us through a few rounds of this to get us started. Before I do that, take stock real quickly in yourself, right? So spend a few seconds and do a quick scan. How you feel, what you feel in your body right now, whether it's relaxed, whether it's tense, whether it's in pain, whether it's comfortable, whether it's hot or cold. Just become more aware for a moment of that sensory related experience. And then in just a moment, I'll lead us through some breathing. Okay. So we're going to breathe in for 3, hold for 3, exhale for 3, hold for 3. Breathe in for 3, hold for 3, exhale for 3, Exhale for 3. Hold for 3. Inhale for 3. Hold for 3. Exhale for 3. And hold for 3. Now, take that scan again. Take stock of how you feel, if there are any changes. You've been able to slow down a little bit. Keep in mind the word slow. That's a key word to all of these processes, most of these processes. And notice now, right? So the goal is to move yourself quickly into a different emotional space based on a physiological or a biological process. That's one of the keys to acute or immediate stress management at all times, which is why I wanted to start out with that. Now, a few things about our discussion. I'm going to be off and running now, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. And I'm going to be glancing over at my clock occasionally so that I can try to stay a little on track. You know, one never knows in these types of discussions what may come up and what somebody might be compelled to share. But some stimulating, some challenging feelings can be stimulated, can come up. And it's important to be mindful of that and be careful with those of other people, to respect others' perspectives and just allowing this space for anything that might come up. I don't want to run this too much like a sport group, but it might move into that area a little bit. We are a community, and I would certainly welcome that. That being said, of course, this is, I hope, a very safe place for us to talk. And of course, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to stop and ask, and I'm sure it'll generate some great discussion. And if you do have a question, and I always tell people, and you're a little hesitant to ask, I can guarantee at least a few other people are thinking the same thing. So always put it out there. And here's my disclaimer. I got to move some images around here. Hold on, so I can read everything. So this is not anything exhaustive, right, in terms of data or psychological material, psychological academic material on how to define, recognize, and cope with stress. But it really is just a collection of what I have gathered over the years that I found really helpful in the different practices that I've had. So with that said, let's get going. So stress. Let's take a look at stress. Think for a minute how you would define stress, what that means to you, right? It's a little different for everybody, but for most people, it's unless it's just a little stress that helps you get up and get to work on time, most of the time stress is pretty bad, right? We don't consider it a very good thing, and that's because in anything more than a small dose, it's pretty counterproductive and it feels pretty awful. So when I started out, I looked up what Google said. Google told me it's a feeling of emotional or physical tension, which is spot on, but that just scratches the surface. Stress is also physiological. I wanted to put that in. It's actually a bodily reaction. It involves the release of an actual hormone into your bloodstream, and it gets you ready to go. So when stress is triggered, when a stressor triggers stress within a body, cortisol is released, and your primitive survival brain kicks in, and you have all heard of the fight or flight response. There's another one, which is the freeze response, right? Which is just to not do anything. That's where our primitive kind of cave person brain goes. And it's unfortunate that we still hold on to that from an evolutionary perspective, but that's the way that we work. That's a lot to fight against. That's a lot to work on. And so even more so than just the emotional and physical, I want to dig into this a little more and give you examples of these different domains of stress. So the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, the spiritual. All of these can be symptomatic of or can express stress within the body. So we look at physical, there's pain, GI distress, cramps, headache, increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, shallow breathing. This is key, right? What we what were we just doing? Some deep breathing counters that shallow breathing automatically. It's a great way to cut right into that acute stress. Another really bad one physically is insomnia, right? Racing thoughts when you go to bed. Most people have had those, and those, you know, the worst time of day can be the quietest time of the day, and then it's 4 in the morning and you haven't slept. Intellectual domain, right? So confusion and fogginess, feeling blank, forgetting things, poor concentration, preoccupation, or even perseveration. Perseveration is simply kind of preoccupation to an extreme, right? Such a hyper focus on something, some concern, or some entity that you can't get your mind off of it. The emotional realm. So anger and rage, maybe the most common, sadness, frustration, anxiety, numbness, just feeling checked out, all the way from depression to panic, even panic disorder. We'll talk a little bit more about panic in a bit. And then the spiritual domain. And it's interesting for me to talk about this here in the context of Westminster. In my workaday, I don't often have the opportunity to talk about the spiritual. It's not something that I bring up unless those I'm working with bring it up. And so at times we have rich conversations about the impact of stress on a person's spiritual experience. And it's very real, right? So confusion, these are some words that I thought of: confusion, emptiness, doubt. Although I don't think doubt is always a bad thing, I don't want that to be misinterpreted by any stretch, but it's certainly part of this paradigm. Fear, isolation, and even hopelessness. I think when stress gets to a certain point. So where does it come from? It's quite simple. Threatening thoughts, information, or experience. We can sum it up that way. What happens to us and what we take in. I'll talk in a minute more about the ingesting of stressors. What we take in through what we see, feel, taste, touch, etc. That's what creates the stress. Now there's an important added element here, and this is more where extended trauma comes into play. It's important to point out memory of stress, right? Both conscious, which is on your mind, or subconscious, something that might not be on your mind at the time. Memory of stress can generate more stress. So essentially, stressful memory or trauma can create a current stress reaction. So what happens is you stress about the history of your stress, and it is a nightmare of a cycle to be caught in. It starts out as what is referred to as acute stress disorder, and most of you are probably familiar with the designation of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That's where it goes, sometimes if left unchecked and kind of allowed to really blossom. Again, that is feeling about the memory and then feeling of that memory on top of it, and it just continues to perpetuate. So what I have done now is, you've probably see this on the bottom of the page. I'm going to show you some images, and I've taken a lot of liberty in just not randomly, but in choosing these images off of Google. And they're stressful images, right? So my goal isn't to traumatize anybody by any stretch, but to look at these, and the idea is to absorb these for a minute and take note of your internal response. So we're going to spend a bit of time with each picture. The goal is going to be then to look more specifically at one of the images and consider the absorption of the stressor through that image. So I'll show you these three, and I'll go through them somewhat slowly, hopefully not painfully slowly, and then we'll continue. All right. Before we do that, though, we're going to breathe it out. I'm going to interject some more breathing here. Those images are all loaded and I wanted them to be. I wanted there to be no doubt that there was a lot of stress present. We're going to practice a different kind of breathing. It's called Ujjayi breathing, and it's practiced in yoga. The translation is loosely victory breath. It's a beautiful and even simpler way than box breathing to just really kind of slow things down. And this is the way that when I'm intentionally breathing, this is the way that I do it. This is the one that works for me. So what I want you to do is just take a minute and just pay attention to your natural breath, whatever that is. And as you do that, listening to me, focus a little more on the rhythmic nature of your breath and even it out some, right? So whether that's a second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds, or whether you're counting or not, feel that rhythm, right? It is the rhythm that is the meditation. So continue to look for, feel, and respond to that rhythm. And as you do that, continue the inhales, the exhales. You want to inhale through your nose. You want to exhale through your mouth. So you're bringing in cool air and you're letting go of warm air. And you can make it even more intentional by putting a little noise to that exhale. It's called a ha. So it's a it allows for even a little more focus on that exhale. It keeps you locked in more. It keeps you engaged more with that breath. So it's now. We breathe that out some. We get back to some material. So we're going to look at the process of the stressor becoming stress. This is how I conceptualize it. Those images you saw, right? Those are external experiences. We read about them on our phones every day. We might see them in person. However it is, however we absorb, we experience these encounters. We're taking them in. And we do so primarily through our 5 senses. That's a great way to consider what we are allowing in, right? What I see, what I smell, what I touch or feel, what I hear, and what I taste. It's how we gather information. And that's how a stressor really invades us. Now imagine, conversely, other intake, like cold water, or hot coffee, or favorite music, favorite food, right? So to point out that this intake is both positive and negative, I point that out because that denotes that we have some control over what we take in. It's a critically important piece to stress management. And thinking of this process, of course, as the external entity moving into our bodies and morphing into that internal feeling. And again, herein lies the possibility to better manage stress, right? Controlling the intake. The problem is that when there is an event or a picture or a newscast or anything in front of us that seems too big, we cannot, as a person, as a body, we cannot ingest and integrate that into our experience quick enough. We can't make sense of that quick enough, right? That's when the trouble really starts. That's when even something like panic can occur. In other words, our senses become overwhelmed by an experience and we become essentially terrified. Now, there are varying degrees of that, but that's where stress comes from. That's how it is allowed to get in. if you will. How does it behave? Well, so I like considering, I think of it as an entity, right? It lives and it breathes. It's moving around inside of me, right? If it's left unchecked, it can get worse and worse and worse. And suddenly, again, we feel like we're overwhelmed. There are different speeds of stress, right? So when we think of depression, that's more, most of the time, not always, and especially with teens and children, depression can look very different, right? Depression can look very fast with younger kids, but for adults, depression is slower, right? It slows us down. There are things like lack of interest, lack of appetite. It really just grinds us down. Whereas with anxiety, again, we speed up. So there are different there are different speeds at which all of these feelings operate within our bodies. And one of the ways that we can help manage stress is to match that pacing, right? The best example, the most salient example is with anxiety. Anxiety is quick, it's fast, it's insidious, it comes on out of nowhere. An intervention that does the same is going to have the best chance at helping you out, right? So quick response in feeling, quick response in stress management. And we'll get to those specifically in a little bit. There's also the timing of stress, right? Of course, I'm going to use cancer as an example, that being the world that I live in professionally. Acute stress, getting a cancer diagnosis. Chronic stress, getting cancer treatment, right? So there's the stress of, boom, a one-time event, bad news from a kid, a car wreck, any number of things, right? A friend has fallen ill, and then chronic, which often, as we age, is in the medical realm, right? It's an illness, ongoing chronic illness, which unfortunately all too often is cancer. And remember, it's key to remember it's a sensory experience, right? It's not just what we see, it's what we see, it's all of the senses. We are assaulted in all of those ways. That's the power of the stressor. It comes in on every front. And it lives in a continuum, right? So there are minor stressors. Again, I think I said this example earlier, like a little stress knowing that I needed to give this presentation made me put a PowerPoint together, right? Like that's good stress. It made me maybe help make this stay on track a little better. But more than that, and I might have been immobilized and never been able to complete it, and that wouldn't have been helpful. So that on that continuum, sometimes it can be favorable and helpful, but most of the time, probably not. Now, this is an important slide. I mean, I guess maybe they all are. I think this one's really important. Take a look at this again. Here we are back to this image. I think was just taken last week. Actually, I think this image was taken over the weekend. Think about how this experience is internalized. And again, I mean, I don't want this to be sensationalized, and I hope it doesn't feel that way. But it is in the service of, number one, what's really happening right now, and to very clearly exemplify the assault of a stressor on our senses. So think about an individual in this setting, what she sees, what she hears, what she smells, what she can taste, and what she can feel. I mean, it would undoubtedly be, as her expression clearly demonstrates, entirely overwhelming. Now, this is important, and this slide follows up, because stress, such a profoundly stressful incident like that, and let me point out too that one stressful incident for an individual does not equal the same amount of stressful incident for another individual. I didn't explain that well. What I mean by that is people can be thrown into crisis or trauma for any number of reasons, and because of any number of circumstances. So what might throw me into crisis or trauma might not bother the person next to me at all. The subjectivity of trauma, which results in stress, the subjectivity of these stressors, and the experience of stress is all over the map. And so I say that in the service of giving permission. Some people say, well, I shouldn't be stressed out about that. Well, of course you should be if you're stressed out about it. it makes sense that you are, and the goal is to manage it. These stressors, and again, that last slide exemplifies this, they get coded in our memory. So think about them, these tracks are laid really deep. They don't go away. And they can be recalled through being re-stimulated. We see this in the cancer world all the time, right? So somebody comes in and gets diagnosed with cancer, and they'll say something to me like, you know, I was abused as a kid and I hadn't thought about that for 30 years. Why am I thinking about it now? Well, you're thinking about it now because you're in a state of current trauma. Your feelings are not very well differentiated. Feeling states are not well differentiated internally. And so that trauma literally reaches back and grabs onto the old trauma and pulls it up to the forefront. So that becomes known what's called, it's called complex trauma, right? And that's kind of like the equation would be 1 + 1 = 4 in terms of the potency of trauma. So it's important to point that out because as we go on in life with multiple traumas and multiple stressors in our past, they seem to get older and people will say, I feel like I'm just wearing down. It's not that you're wearing down, it's that the stressors are really adding up and growing on top of each other, which makes each one much more difficult to manage. Which brings me to the next part, right? How do we manage it? So I don't remember what I Googled to pull up all these images, but all these images came up under the same search. It might have just been managing stress, which is exactly what I was looking for, right? So these are not the recommended ways, I say kind of jokingly, but I do think it's telling, right? We now, more than ever, at least in my life, in an unprecedented way, there are stressors coming at us from all angles. And even very specifically now, I would even say between now and November, right? The tension nationally that we are all experiencing is so great. So there has to be something better, right? There has to be some way that we can take better care of ourselves in the moment without much work, without many tools, strategies that are simple and that are tried and true and that work. So that's where we're going to go. And then I forgot that I put that in there. This is what we need. This is, for those of you, this is one of my favorite pictures. This is actually the sound side in Salter Path. For those of you who are familiar with, so yeah, this was out one morning, paddleboarding of all things, and happened to snap this. And it's been one of my go-to kind of peaceful images for a lot of years now. This is where we want to go, right? In our heads, this is where we want to go. So there are, let me check my time. Okay, we're great on time. So there are some basics to focus on when we're looking at managing stressors that come in, and stress that results. Really, there are two approaches in behavioral health and mental health. There are behavioral interventions, what I can do, right? And then there are, we'll call them medicinal interventions, right? So, and I'll touch on that very briefly. That's out of my scope of practice. I am not a psychiatrist. I don't prescribe medication. I work with psychiatrists who do. We consult all the time. So I'll comment on that a little bit at the end in terms of in a consultative kind of way, but we're going to kind of leave that one alone because my focus is on behavioral intervention, what a person can do. Now, my disclaimer is this. Imagine a graph and the baseline is no stress, and as you go up, your stress increases, right? As the line goes up on a graph. And at some point you kind of hit a red zone. That's different for everybody, but when you hit a certain level of stress, of anxiety, of panic, of fear, behavioral interventions kind of go out the window, right? They are wonderful for minor, moderate, even maybe heading into severe stressors, depending on the practice and how much they have been practiced. But for really severe, debilitating stress, the first line of treatment is usually medication. And that's not a bad thing at all. It's, in fact, it's miraculous. But again, given my scope, this isn't a psychiatry consult, so I'm going to leave that one alone for now. So as I said earlier too, these are strategies to practice, and you want to practice moving into these early, right? So when you start feeling stress, the discomfort of stress, for example, taking a minute to breathe, to intentionally breathe, as soon as that stress is felt, that's going to give you the best outcome. When you match the pace of the stress you're experiencing, your outcome is going to be better. And remember the idea of intake. I love this idea, right? We respond to what we absorb. What you're going to take in through breathing, water, nourishment, movement and play, rest, sleep. The next slide is about sleep. I need to talk about that specifically for a minute. Meditation and prayer, humor, which is the underestimated strategy. Distraction. Distraction is a brilliant. People often say, am I just sticking my head in the sand? No, distraction can be a brilliant strategy for managing stress. And what we're doing right now, connecting with others. I want to say something real quickly about meditation and prayer. For me, I very easily get lost in prayer when I'm praying alone, and I'll ramble. And especially if it's at night and I'm praying to myself and I get sleepy, I don't feel like I stay focused, and it just doesn't work so great for me. And so prayer for me is actually when I breathe into prayer, and even it almost becomes a chant. That's oftentimes a more effective way for me to stay focused and pray. And a great side effect is that it also calms me down. So I tend to believe that there's a strong spiritual component to that. Those two, again, meditation and prayer for me are very closely linked. Let's move on for a minute to sleep. This is huge, right? So there's breathing and there's sleep. The two fundamentals, I guess I would say. If you don't sleep well, your ability to manage stress will, as long as the poor sleep continues, will be significantly compromised. There is no doubt about that. There aren't many definites in the world of psychology, but that's pretty much a definite. Poor sleep and too little, inadequate amounts of sleep result in decreasing in emotional resilience, right? Your ability to recover from a stressful event, and worsening feelings, primarily, especially depression and anxiety. Now, if you do suffer, and this is where I'll put a quick, not a plug in, but I'll go ahead and say this, I'll say it again in a little bit. If you suffer from poor sleep, this might, and it's chronic, and you would like to have a further discussion about this, that's a good thing to ask me about on the side or in another discussion, or reach out to Marita. I'll certainly give you my contact information at the end of this tonight, because there are strategies, there are psychologists who specialize in what's called sleep hygiene, and it really works. Now, again, at a certain level, with a certain level of sleep dysfunction, medicine can be helpful. I don't want to deny that at all. But this practice of sleep hygiene can be so helpful. And I don't teach that, but I certainly have plenty of colleagues and know people in the community who do. And it can be quite magical. So keep that in mind. Sleep is gold, absolutely. Now, some basic practices, right? And I'm gonna, okay, we're good on time. I keep looking. So again, I'll keep saying this, controlling what comes in and the rate at which it does so. That's the strategy. And you can do that through breathing. Diaphragmatic breathing is just belly breathing, right? So, and we won't practice this now, but try this. If you're interested in breathing technique, look up belly breathing. You will actually get, and you can belly breathe with a box breath or with ujjayi breathing. It's a way to breathe deeper, and basically you're breathing down into your diaphragm instead of just filling up the upper parts of your lungs. You have much more space to get air in if you practice doing that. And again, the result, not surprisingly, is it can work to calm you down even more. It can slow you down even more. And then some of the nose breath cycles, similar, or even what we were practicing earlier. Meditation. Now, this is all the stuff you hear. There are a lot of buzzwords here. Mindful practice, meditation. It gets a lot of these strategies get a lot of playtime these days, and they do with good reason. Meditation is both simple and can be incredibly challenging. Some of the beautiful parts of a meditation practice are making time in your day and creating the time to do that. That can also give space for prayer, right? So there are these great intersections. Meditations can be counting, drinking and eating. There is a wonderful practice of breathing and taking a drink of water, and then breathing and taking a drink of water until the glass is empty. That can be a long meditation or not, but it's a beautiful way to really practice more than one type of nourishment at one time. Another thing to consider if you're interested in any of these strategies is just look for, I just use free apps. I have a breathing app. Actually, I think it's called the breathing app. And it just has tones. A tone goes higher for my inhale, and then it goes lower for my exhale. And you can change the length of time it does it. You can change the intervals of the inhale, exhale, all these, there's some variations. And they're so easy to use. And so the goal is to create easy access for yourself for any of these strategies to increase the likelihood that you're actually going to do it, right? Therein lies the challenge. The RAIN strategy, this is one that I use in, I won't talk about this too much, but I do want to point it out. It's one that I use more for panic attacks. A panic attack, by definition, it's really not going to last more than 10 or 15 minutes typically. And so the goal becomes recognizing what you're going through in those moments of intense fear, accepting what you're going through and saying, hey, I can ride this wave, I can do this. Take a look at it, take a step out, say, is this really that bad? Is this really going to get me? And then the result of that is to be able to say, actually, it's not, and you can non-identify, you can step away from it. So that, again, for a severe stressor, one of the examples that I always use is the fear of mortality, right? I talk to people a lot about that fear of dying. And when people, the real experience of fear of dying comes often in a wave of a panic attack. And it's this overtaking sense of, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. I can't shake that, but it will pass. And for something like that, it's a wonderful strategy to use. There's a lot more about, if you just look up RAIN strategy online, there's plenty that's been written about this, and it's highly effective. And then another one that I really like to do, I do this one a lot actually with kids, but it's just great for adults as well, is the 5 senses meditation. And I'll leave it at that, but take a look at that and give it a try sometime, because it's really cool. It's really cool. And it's easy. It's sometimes entertaining, which is good too. A little humor, right? Like when one of the things I see is my dogs fighting with each other or whatever, when I'm trying to do that, it's not a bad thing. And so it can be helpful in a very different way. And then some longer term strategies, right? And for the sake of time, so that we have some time to chat, I just want to mention these. I love yoga, I have to say, and I'm a latecomer to it, and I'm about as inflexible as they come. But what it does for me in terms of relaxation is extraordinary. But any of these, right? Any of these strategies right now, they can be so effective. But all that they really require is just an initial commitment, right? Enough to make it a practice. And what makes a practice for one person is different than the next person. For one person can do something for a week and they're in. Another person may struggle with it for 6 months before they kind of lock onto that strategy. It doesn't matter. It's finding something you're willing to commit to until it goes somewhere, right? And if the somewhere it goes is not productive, then you try something else, right? That's a very non-judgmental approach, a very mindful approach to doing this. Of course, I'd put in virtual connection because we're going to be here tonight, but I do think it's really important, and who knows how long it's going to be important for us as a church as well. I say when I drove through, I have to say as an aside, when we drove through and saw everybody at church on Sunday, we did the drive-by. It was really good to see faces, and it just made me really sad. It made me sad to see that big old building sitting there empty. And so virtual connection is second place at best. But I think we have to utilize what we can and really reach out as much as possible. And then I did want to point out here toward the end, if you have more questions for me, if you're interested in other resources, please let me know. My team and I are very integrated in the Duke system, but we have a lot of really close colleagues in the UNC system. We're really connected to the Durham and Raleigh and Chapel Hill community providers. So, and know as well that if you did reach out to me, of course, it would all be confidential. It would all be private. I've had these conversations all the time. In fact, the example I'll give right now is this past week, I had 4 employees at Duke reach out and ask for service recommendations for their kids because their kids are so anxious right now. So it's all over us right now. Please don't hesitate at all to reach out. And I'll put up some contact information in a minute. And I also I remembered to say this, Marita. If anybody wants a copy of this, certainly we can get you a copy of the slide. This is what I'm going to end with in terms of me talking so much. So this young Pueblo has become one of my current favorite poets. And I just happened upon this book actually in a bookstore in Salt Lake City when we were visiting last year. And so I'm going to read it because it's just beautiful. I knew I was on the right path when I started feeling peace in situations where I would normally feel tension. Sums it up. That's the goal. That's what we're looking for. And that's how we get through all of this, right? So let's look at some mountains that are above Montreat. Another one of my favorite images. I didn't take this the past summer because we didn't go to Montreat. I took it the last summer. Let's do a little bit more breathing, and then we're going to move into some questions and answers. So let's just do some Ujjayi breathing for a minute. One of the things that can be helpful too, and if you've ever been led through any of these groups, you'll hear people say this: kind of get your feet flat on the floor. Be aware of your back, how you're in a chair. Maybe soften your eyes a little bit. And I'm just going to inhale and exhale, and that'll take us out. We'll do several rounds. So breathe in through the nose. Exhale. Breathe in. Out. In. Out. And in. And out. Thank you all very much. I appreciate that. I hope that was helpful.